Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to try to quickly cover a topic that we could really spend years talking about. And each one of the subtopics, we could go on forever and ever. But since we're on the eve of the Western Easter, the Eastern Easter will be in just over a month from now, and Passover is a week away, and we'll see how they coincide. What we're going to try to do today is really answer the questions. What was the Last Supper? When was it? And we'll understand why that is an important question. Where was it? And what did it mean? What were the messages that were behind it? So we'll start with a short film. Well, we'll be reading the verses in 1 second, so we'll move onwards. For some reason, why you can't hear, I don't know, but okay. But so I'll just, here you see, again, first Jesus blessed the wine, then Jesus is blessing the bread. Now, in this case, from this movie, he's saying the traditional Jewish blessing. You can see the bread in his hand, and we'll be getting back to that. That's unleavened bread, known as nowadays as matzah. It doesn't appear in the Bible, and you can see, take a look how they're sitting. We're going to be dealing with that also. And then Jesus passes that around, says, this is my body, and we will move onwards to actually get the film we just saw is based on the Gospel of Luke, and we'll see there are major differences between them, and we'll try to understand them. So we'll start with Luke. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, remember that, drew nigh. Again, we're using the King James Version in honor of the Anglican Church, which is called the Passover. Now, factually, that's not true, and we'll understand why this is so important. There are actually two different holidays. There's the holiday of the Passover, and there's the holiday of the unleavened bread. They came the day of the unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. In other words, Passover was killed the afternoon before the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And he sent Peter and John saying, go and prepare us the Passover. In other words, make the Passover. Now, again, we'll talk about this a little bit later. Passover means the Passover, the sacrifice that was sacrificed. So when the word Passover appears, that means the lamb that was slaughtered. And they say unto him, where wilt thou that we prepare? Where we're going to hold it? And he said unto them, behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you bearing a pitcher of water. A pitcher of water will be very important for us to understand where this took place later. Follow him into the house where he entereth in, and ye shall say unto the good man of the house, the master saith unto thee, where is the guest chamber? Now, just keep in mind, the master saying unto me, in other words, there was most likely an already existing relationship between Jesus and these people, where I shall eat the Passover, again, the sacrifice, and he shall shew you a large upper room, furnished, there make ready. And they went and they found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. And when the hour was come, he sat down with the 12 apostles, and he said unto them, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took the cup and gave thanks. Again, remember, he's saying first the cup, in other words, over the wine first. Take this and divide it amongst yourselves. For I say unto you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until kingdom of God shall come. Now, using the term fruit of the vine is very important, because that is the traditional Jewish blessing that is said over the wine. You say, blessed art thou, our Lord, our God, King or ruler of the universe, who creates fruit of the vine. So the fruit of the vine is actually the term which gives us, and then he goes on, blesses the bread, passes it around. We'll get back to that. So let's start trying to understand what this means and the differences. Just one interesting example, we'll understand maybe why later, is Matthew and Mark, Jesus will first bless the bread and only then the wine. In John's story, he does not bless he gives no message of the wine and the bread being his flesh, even though he had talked about it earlier in the book of John. Now, there's Passover and there's the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Let's read what the Bible tells us. In Leviticus 23, we are told, in the 14th day of the first month in the Bible is called the month of Aviv, or the month of spring. In the time of Jesus, the names of the months already had Persian names as it is till today, the month of Nisan, and it is the first month in the biblical tradition in those days. Some of you might know that nowadays, the New Year is celebrated on the 7th month, the month of Tishrei. That's when Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur take place. And there are 4 different New Years in the Jewish tradition, but the biblical New Year is the first month. And on the 14th day of that month is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is a feast. In other words, we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about the day of the Passover, and the day after that is the day of the unleavened bread, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which lasts for 7 days. In the first day, in other words, the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Day, ye shall have a holy convocation, ye shall not servile work therein. In other words, you're forbidden from working, and you shall make special offerings for the holiday, not the offering of the Passover. The offering of the Passover was done on the 14th, not on the 15th. So you have the Passover and you have the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Nowadays, you'll ask people, what holiday are you celebrating? They'll say, I'm celebrating Passover. Even if you ask Jews, 95% of them will answer that. That's not the biblical description. In Exodus, we're told where this comes from. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire, with unleavened bread. In other words, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. In other words, when you eat the sacrifice, which you eat it, which is interesting because you have the 2 holidays crossing each other, on the evening of the 15th, you slaughter the animal on the 14th and you eat it on the 15th. And then you eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Eat it not raw, not sodden at all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs, in other words, the complete animal, and ye shall let nothing of it remain till the morning, and thus shall ye eat it. Then you come with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, like the children of Israel when they left Egypt. Because if you go back to the story of the children of Israel leaving Egypt, they slaughtered the animal on the 10th, and its blood was what protected the children of Israel on the 14th when the final plague hit and the death of the firstborn. The blood of that animal, of the Passover sacrifice, protected the children of Israel. Keep that in mind. That will come back later on in our talk. It is the Lord's Passover. And then later on we are told, which will be important for us later, in one house shall it be eaten. You have to eat it in one specific house. Thou shalt not carry forth out of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall ye break a bone thereof. Keep that in mind. That will come back in a later talk. Okay, famous pyramids of Egypt. Prime Minister Begin of Israel, when the peace talks with the Egyptians were taking place, he prided himself that the Jews, when they were slaves in Egypt, built the pyramids. And that almost led to a breakdown of the talks because the children of Israel did not build the pyramids. The children of Israel built 2 towns, Pitom and Ramses, but dating back from a similar period. Numbers 33, we read the story of the children of Israel leaving, and they departed from Ramses, one of the 2 cities the children of Israel did build, in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. In other words, that's after the blood protected them. That's when they left. And the morrow after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with an high hand in the sight of the Egyptians. Exodus 12, that ye shall say, it is a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. The Passover is for God. You eat it, but it's for God, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel. Because the word in Hebrew for Passover is Pesach, which also means to literally pass over. So they passed over. The word here is ki Pasach, the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses, and the people bowed the head and worshiped. Now, in the Mishnah is the oral Jewish law that was codified in the Galilee, beginning of the 3rd century. And Psachim, the one that deals with Passover, we read, Rabban Gamliel would say, anyone who did not say these 3 matters on Passover has not fulfilled his obligation. The Paschal Lamb, that's the Passover, matzah, in other words, the unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. When one mentions these matters, he must elaborate and explain them. The Paschal Lamb is brought because of the omnipresence passed over. As God passed over the houses of our forefathers in Egypt, as it is said, thou shalt say, it is a sacrifice of the Lord's Paschal offering as he passed over the houses of the children of Israel. Now, if you look at Rabban Gamliel, for some of you that might ring a bell, because Rabban Gamliel made it into the book of Acts. Why? When Paul testifies about himself, he says, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in the city at the feet of Gamliel. That's the same Gamliel. There were 3 Rabbi Gamliels. This one we know was the elder Gamliel, who lived in the time of Jesus and in the time of Paul. So here we have a tradition from the time of Jesus, what needs to take place on the celebration of the Passover. In Numbers 9, we read, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if any man of you or of your posterity shall be unclean by reason of a dead body or a journey afar off, ye shall keep the Passover unto the Lord, the 14th day of the 2nd month. This is the 2nd Passover. And why is this important? Because it shows how separate the Feast of the Unleavened Bread is and the Feast of the Passover. If you miss the Feast of Passover, the unleavened bread, that's it. But every Jew is obliged to partake in the Feast of Passover. Passover, yes. Unleavened bread, if you miss it, you missed it. So they're 2 totally different celebrations. Here we'll see a short film. Hopefully we'll be able to hear it. If not, it's not the end of the world. But the one place in the world where the actual sacrificing of the Paschal Lamb still takes place is with the Samaritans. Some of you heard the very interesting lecture about the Samaritans. And again, 2 seconds about the Samaritans. Samaritans live in Samaria near the town of Shechem. Shechem is the place, the famous story with the Samaritan woman. The Samaritans are not Jewish. The Samaritans were brought into the area by the Assyrians when the 10 tribes were sent abroad. The Samaritans were brought in. And as was the tradition in those days, you adopt the local god. The local god they adopted was Jehovah. They accepted the Jewish Bible, but with time the major difference they made was any time Jerusalem is mentioned, it was changed to Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim is the story with Joshua, where the blessings and the curses on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. So they are not Jewish, but they preserve the Jewish traditions just with the moving of Jerusalem to Mount Gerizim into the area of Shechem. Until today, they still have the yearly sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb, and it is almost identical to how it was in the time of Jesus. The only difference is we're told, let's say, towards the end of Jesus' life, around in the year 3031, we have documentation that claims the 600,000 people came up to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage and the sacrificing of the Paschal Lamb. Today, there's 700 and something Samaritans left in the world. They all come to Mount Gerizim or come to Shechem for the sacrificing of it. This is the prayer before the sacrificing of the lamb. being led by somebody who leads the prayer. And next to him, in 1 minute, you'll see somebody dressed in green. That is the high priest. Here we can see the high priest, and he's saying Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The prayer is in Aramaic. So here they're saying the prayers before the sacrifice, as in the time of the temple. It wasn't the high priest who would sacrifice, or even the priests. Here you can see another one of the priests leading, because leading the services are all priests. Everybody dressed in white. Now you can see that the pace will pick up, and they're about to give the order of the slaughtering. And now they're all starting to slaughter. You can see people burnt down, and then they slaughter again, as is the tradition, a lamb for a householder, more or less. The last year they slaughtered 27 lambs. And one of the first things that are done is they take the blood, and the blood they share it with the family. Every Samaritan will have, you can see this man over here with his family putting blood on their foreheads as part of the element of the blood protecting them from, and this is the highest moment of the year. And just, you can see, and at the very, very end, at 1 second, you'll see the altar. Here we have the altar in the background, because that's where certain elements of the lamb are removed. This is what the sacrificing of the lambs, of the Paschal Lamb, would have looked like in the time of the temple on the Temple Mount, but of course not 26 lambs. Based on the description, they're probably more like 50,000 lambs. Now that we get the idea of the sacrificing the Paschal Lamb, let's see, what did the Last Supper look like? Now, this is the first picture that jumps to everybody's mind. Enough, so this is how this picture actually came to be.
Ah, Leonardo.
Buongiorno.
Just a second. It's all right. We ordered a group portrait.
Ah. Yeah, Fernanda, this is no good. All I got is a box. Okay. Everybody want to be in the picture? Get up and go to the other side of the table. Come on.
Okay, so that's not actually the true story, but it's from Mel Brooks' History of the World, Part 1, because that's not at all what it looked like. So what I would like to do for the next coming minutes is really to try to get an idea what the Last Supper looked like, so you'll be able to actually visualize it. Here we have an attempt to depict what the Passover celebration would look like. The lamb is on the table. People are all, again, sitting down, but that's not really what happened. Let's try to visit some sources that'll tell us what the Last Supper or what a Passover celebration would look like. In the Babylonian Talmud, again, written around 6th century, in the tractate of Passover, we're told, Rabbi Judah said that Shmuel said, again, the Jewish tradition is the earlier the rabbi you quote, and Shmuel, again, we're talking about more or less a bit before Jesus, said the halakha, in other words, the Jewish ruling, is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Judah, who said that one must interrupt one's meal by removing the table entirely. Now, the discussion that was taking place there was what happens if you're eating or doing something leading up to Passover, and it's time to have the Passover celebration. What do? Rabbi Judah says you remove the table entirely, which sounds strange, but we'll understand how that is possible. Nor is it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, who ruled that one need not interrupt one's meal at all. Rather, one must spread a cloth over one's table. and recite the Kiddush, in other words, the blessing over the wine, and then they continue with the celebration. A similar tradition, and we'll get a better idea, we can see from Satyrcon, which is attributed to Prenrius Arbiter Gaius. Again, same time as Jesus. There's a Greek source, and it says, Hen complimented upon those elegant extras, and the host cried out, Mars loves a fair fight. And so I ordered each one a separate table. That way, these stinking slaves won't make us so hot with the crowding. That we'll leave out the politically incorrect ending to the story, but the tradition was in those days, if you're a wealthy enough man, and Passover symbolizes freedom from slavery, each person would have, or maybe each two people would have their own table. And then the food would be brought around. Here we can see an attempt to depict what it would look like. People would probably be sitting on stools or on the floor. Here you have a few tables connected, but much closer than Da Vinci's depiction. Here's another attempt to depict, again, people sitting down, because the leaning back was a sign of free men in Greece, as they would have on those sofas that we're familiar with. And then you would have your individual table, or you can see maybe tables put together. Here are three examples of three-legged tables as they were in those days that have been found, which actually were individual tables that were used 2,000 years ago, which is more or less the dates of these tables. So people would be sitting around with an individual table and their own utensils. So now that we know more or less what it looked like, let's start dealing with, was the Last Supper actually the Passover Seder? Because that's extremely important, because one, it gives us a date, and two, the messages that Jesus gives from the wine and the bread and his behavior will help us understand what the message he was actually trying to give. So here, of course, we have a depiction, at least people sitting on both sides. Anybody who wants to identify Judas is easily identified. Everybody has a halo except for Jesus. He has the pointy beard. Animal on the table, theoretically the Paschal Lamb, and the round bread. So this Christian depiction is saying the Last Supper was the Passover Seder. And as many of you, it's a growing phenomena within certain elements of the Christian world today to actually celebrate a Passover Seder, to, in other words, reenact or pay respect or follow Jesus' word of celebrating the Seder. So Matthew 26 says, now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In other words, the first day, the Jewish tradition, days start at night. So the first day is the night of the 15th. That's exactly when the Paschal Lamb would have been eaten, because it was slaughtered on the 14th, and in the evening after the holiday, when the holiday of unleavened bread starts, the disciples came to Jesus saying unto him, where should we eat the Passover? So according to Matthew, undoubtedly the Passover Seder. And he said, go into the city, keep that in mind, into the city. We'll deal with that when we identify the location of the Last Supper. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples. Mark has a similar, and again, traditionally Mark is the first of the disciples, or the first of the Gospels, and he says this, and the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, it really shows that when they had already killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, etc. Luke, we already saw. Then came the day of unleavened bread. John gives us a totally different story, and he tells us this. Now, before the feast of the Passover, in other words, the 15th, when Jesus knew his hour was coming, so we're talking about the 14th, his hour was come that he should depart out of the world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And then it goes on, and the supper ended. So the supper ended before the feast of Passover. So that was on the 14th. And in John 19, we're told, the Pilate says, and it was the preparation of the Passover. In other words, the day that the Passover was slaughtered at about the 6th hour, he saith unto the Jews, behold your kings. Here we have Pilate. So Jesus' crucifixion, according to John, took place before the Feast of Passover. The preparation day and the Last Supper was the day before. So we have two different stories. The people have tried to read into the text in such a way that they're really saying the same thing. It doesn't work. So either we have John's version or we have Mark, Matthew, and Luke's version. Was the Last Supper the Passover, or was it the preparation? And what is this preparation thing? Does such a tradition exist? In 1 Corinthians, so here we're having Paul's version, which is the earliest amongst these all, because the book of the letters to Corinthians was written probably around the year 55. This is what Paul says. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the same night on which he was betrayed took bread, not unleavened bread, took bread. In other words, it's before the Passover. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he took the cup after the supper. Again, different than the tradition that it was during the supper. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Remember that? We're going to get back to that. This do as often as you drink it and remember me. So Paul coincides with John. Mark, Luke, and Matthew differ. 1 Corinthians takes it a stage farther. Put out therefore old leaven, because the commandment is on Passover. Leaven cannot be found in the house, that ye may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. You're like the Passover. For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. In other words, when Jesus died, he became the Passover. So his crucifixion had to be, his sacrificing, so to say, took place on the day of the 14th, before the 15th. So therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with leaven of malice or wickedness, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So letters to the Corinthians strengthens Paul's claim that they were not talking about the Passover Seder, we're talking about the day before. Now, there was a publication by Joachim Jeremias, The Eucharist Words of Jesus, which was the first attempt to really dig into, and he gave 14 points why the Last Supper was the Passover celebration. The Last Supper took place in Jerusalem. We'll see later that, according to the tradition, had to take place within the walls of the city, in a room made available to pilgrims for that purpose, because in the Jewish tradition, we're told that one of the miracles of Passover was that there was room for everybody in the city of Jerusalem, because, as we will see in a couple of minutes, the sacrifice had to be inside the walls of the city of Jerusalem, as was the case with the Last Supper. It was held during the night. That's when the Passover sacrifice was eaten. Jesus celebrated that meal with his family of disciples, because you eat it based on a family or based on a group, which was acceptable and traditional. When they ate, they reclined as part of the symbolism of being free people, as free people would eat. The meal was eaten in a state of ritual purity. I'm not exactly sure where he came up with that, but let's say yes. Bread was broken during the meal, not at the beginning of the meal. Now, here he's dealing with an interesting issue, because the bread was broken during the meal, according to some of the sources, but that's like with the tradition of sharing the matzah, the unleavened bread. Wine was consumed, and the wine was red. How do we know the wine was red? Probably interpreting the element that this is my blood. In the Jewish tradition, wine should be red when you drink it, because we have a verse in the book of Psalms that says, don't see wine, but that it shall be red. There were last-minute preparations for the meal, after which alms were given, and a hymn was sung, because even at the time of Jesus, we know for a fact that chapters from the book of Psalms were read, which is known as the Hallel, the praising of God. Jesus and his disciples then remained in Jerusalem, and Jesus discussed the symbolic significance of the meal, just as Jews do during the Passover Seder, because The Passover Seder is not just to eat and feast, but also to learn and study and explain. Here we have 14 reasons why the Last Supper was the Passover meal. So was it the Seder? Let's see. If this was a Passover meal, why do we have no mentioning of the eating of the Paschal Lamb? That is the center of the meal. We have wine, we have bread, which exists in almost any meal. There is no mentioning of eating the Paschal Lamb. There's no bitter herbs. The tradition in those days, was to drink 4 cups of wine, not mentioned in any way, means, or form. Back to our friend Rabban Gamliel. Anyone who does not say these 3 matters on Passover has not fulfilled his obligation. They did not say the Paschal Lamb. They did not say the unleavened bread. They did not mention the bitter herbs. We know that amongst the Pharisees and amongst the Essenes, collegial meals were shared with fellowships, chavurot. A chavurah is a group of people coming together, at which like-minded fellows, chaverim, shared food and company they considered pure. In other words, the element of coming together as a group and eating a joint meal was a tradition that existed, not just for Passover. Let's say with the Dead Sea, with the Essenes or the people, the Yachad people at the Dead Sea, that would happen every day, twice a day, except their meals were totally silent. 1 Corinthians, we once again, for even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us, as we just mentioned. In a very important book called The Jewish People of the First Century, written by a person who has since passed away, called David Flusser, who was considered maybe the greatest expert of Jesus and his life, and was a Jew and was an historian dealing with the Second Temple period. He said, categorically, based on his research, and he quoted many sources, the evening before Passover, in other words, as is mentioned in John, the preparatory day, evening which starts on the 14th of Aviv or of Nisan, the eve itself was a sort of feast because the Paschal sacrifice was offered that afternoon, the afternoon afterwards. In other words, the gathering together could go either way. It does not have to be Passover. In the Babylonian Talmud, we're told on Passover, and here we have a very interesting, one of the rare sources where Jesus is mentioned in the Jewish sources, and we're told this, on Passover Eve, in other words, the eve of the sacrificing of Passover. Now this was documented or written down in the 5th century, but it's quoting a source from the 2nd or 3rd century. And it says this, on Passover Eve, they hung the corpse of Jesus of Nazareth, the Nazarene, after they'd killed him by stoning. We're not going to get into the question why they mentioned the fact that he was stoned and wasn't crucified. And a crier went out before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming Jesus of the Nazarene is going to be stoned. In other words, the idea of leading to his being killed was a plan that dated way back before that, similar to some of the stories in the New Testament. But maybe the most important point that has to be mentioned, if we take the following stories, if indeed Jewish authorities were involved in Jesus' trial and death, as it is mentioned in all the Gospels, then according to the synoptics, those authorities would have engaged in activities holding trials and carrying out executions that were either forbidden, or not either, but they were forbidden on a holiday. Because if the Last Supper was on the 15th of Nisan, in other words, the Passover Seder, Passover already took place. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, could not have met, and they could not have tried him. Caiaphas could not have brought together the 23, and that's for a different lecture. Most people talk about 71, but the 23 Jews who then partook in Jesus' trial. So there's no way that if the Passover evening was, the Last Supper was on the 15th, Jesus could not have been tried the next day or executed. So as such, it is more or less, we could say, impossible that the Last Supper was the Passover celebration. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, why do we have these two traditions? And that's exactly the question I'm asking now. And here we see a picture of Jesus, Peter and James. James, Jesus' brother, who then went on to lead the Judeo-Christian community in Jerusalem. We have the school of Peter versus the school of James. The James group, which adopted the tradition that it was the Last Supper, was on Passover, was the Passover meal. Why? They insisted that the direction of the church should be in the hands of practicing Jews, not under control of teachers such as Paul, who were willing to depart from some of the Jewish traditions. And how do you do that? We'll find out one second. Peter, and also Paul, the group drew its support from members who were active in Jerusalem, Galilee, and Syria, conceived of Jesus as offering a fresh understanding of the covenant God had made with Israel and opening it up to outsiders. So how does this work with the question of the Passover meal? The basic element of the Seder, the lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, are notably absent from the Last Supper. By identifying Jesus' Last Supper with the Paschal meal, the Jamesian group managed to limit participation in the Eucharist to Jews, since circumcision and being a Jew was a prerequisite to being able to partake in the Passover celebration. So if you want to participate in the traditions in the Eucharist that follows afterwards, only a Jew can do it. So that way, the idea that the Last Supper was a Passover, which was then preserved, interesting enough, by Luke, Matthew, and Mark, was a way to preserve the Jewish element of the Judeo-Christian movement against Paul for sure, and Peter's reaching out also. Paul never accepted the limitations of the Jamesian group, and we can see the conflicts in the Jerusalem Council and elsewhere. He placed the Last Supper on the night Jesus was handed over, not Passover. And in that way, non-Jewish Christians who were Paul's particular concern could partake fully in the Lord's Last Supper, because in the Bible, it clearly says that anybody who's not Jewish cannot partake, but we're not talking about the Passover celebration. Just here we can see on the screen some spectacular stone cups that were found in the area of Jerusalem. What was unique about stone is it could not become impure. That's why that would be. So when Jesus passes around his cup, this was probably what it looked like. Now, Matthew 26, he says, this is the blood of the covenant. Jesus' blood becomes a seal of a new covenant, according to Matthew. Now, what is the meaning of a new covenant? And just side comment, the King James Bible mistranslated into a New Testament, but it's a new covenant, and we'll see exactly why. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with these words. In other words, the message that's coming across when Jesus says, this is my blood, he's not saying that this is physically my blood, as let's say is the tradition in the Catholic Church, but this is the blood of the covenant. This is the symbolizing. Cause just one side comment, to a Jew in those days, to say, drink, this is my blood, they would be shocked, because one of the most prominent elements that are forbidden in the Jewish tradition from the book of Genesis is blood is forbidden to drink. So to say, this is my blood, they're saying, cut your ties with the biblical commandments. And Jesus specifically said, I've not come to change even one iota, really one. So the link between Jesus and Moses, the leading into Passover, with Moses sacrificing the Paschal Lamb and Jesus being the Paschal Lamb. And the element of blood is the sign of the new covenant that is being signed. And for that reason, the links between Moses and Passover and Jesus and Passover are very, very strong. In Genesis 49, we read something very interesting. I'll start with the beginning, and I'll then go to the last verse, because the beginning is important for us to understand the end of our talk. Judah, we're talking about Jacob blessing his children. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. Then we have the scepter shall not depart from Judah. In other words, Judah will be the kings. They will be the leaders. Again, keep in mind that the New Testament goes out of its way to link Jesus to King David. And in the final verse, binding his donkey to the vine, and his donkey's called to a choice vine, he washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. So the link between grapes or wine and blood, when they said, this is my blood, there's a very good chance that they understood where that was coming from. The Peteran group, the wine represented blood, which means sacrificial confirmation, as in the case of Moses. Only later was there the direct link to the actual blood, but here we're having Moses, who led the children out of Egypt to freedom on earth, gave them the covenant, and Jesus is leading them into heaven, giving them the new covenant. 1 Corinthians, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Mark says, then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them. In other words, we're talking about a single cup of wine. This is my blood, the new covenant, which is shed for many. So here we're having Jesus comparing himself to the Paschal Lamb. Now, the Paschal Lamb, and this is a misinterpretation, which is frequently done, people compare that the Paschal Lamb's purpose is to take people's sins. That is not the case. The element of a lamb, we have the scapegoat, which takes the sins. The Paschal Lamb serves as protection, just like he protects them, and through that they receive freedom. That's what the Paschal Lamb would have represented. And now, interestingly enough, in the same chapter in Mark, when he said, this is my blood, and he talks about the cup, he's 12 verses later, Jesus is already in the gardens of Gethsemane, and he said, Abba, Father. Again, he just said, just Abba. He did not say Father, but that was translated for people to understand. All things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. In other words, once again, I'm sharing my cup with you. I'm requesting God take the cup, because frequently in the Bible, a cup can symbolize death, but a cup can also symbolize happiness. And as King David says in the book of Psalms, thou preparest a table before me, Last Supper, in the presence of mine enemies, Judas. Thou anointest my head with oil. Jesus had his feet anointed, but anointing with oil can be two things. Now, I'm not saying that this is what King David was saying, but the element of that, you anoint with oil, kings and priests are anointed with oil, but so are bodies. My cuppeth runneth over is a sign of happiness. Now that we've gotten a basic idea of some of the messages and what was taking place in the Last Supper, where was the Last Supper? Here we can see the room of the Last Supper that anybody who comes to Jerusalem visits, and will understand a bit about it. Let's try to place it according to the biblical texts. Luke 22 said this, and he said unto them, behold, when ye are entered into the city. So you're inside the city of Jerusalem. Jesus was staying outside of the city of Jerusalem. He was staying in a suburb or an area outside of the wall. There shall a man meet you bearing a pitcher of water. What does a pitcher of water mean? So there have been attempts to interpret it that it was for purity purposes, etc. He was bringing fresh water, most likely. And there was only one place he could bring fresh water from. And that's from the pool of Siloam, later on where Jesus cured the blind man. Followed him into the house and entered it. And ye shall say unto the good man of the house, the master saith unto thee, where is the guest chambers? So they go, because we'll see what a house looked like and we'll get an idea. And they went to a large upper room furnished. What does furnished mean here? In other words, that they did not have to bring tables and bring stools or benches. So the room was, now why would this person have an upper room that's furnished? Because one of the major sources, and not one of the major sources of income, but anybody who had a house within the walls of the old city would rent it out over Passover, because the Paschal Lamb had to be eaten inside the city. So that's why there were multiple rooms, usually rooftops. And it's possible that the upper room could mean a rooftop, but here it actually says a room, it actually says a room. Now, let's take a look. Here is the temple. These are the walls of Jerusalem, not in the way they were in the time of Jesus. We'll see what they were in the time of Jesus. This is the old city of Jerusalem today. The Cenacle and Mount Zion are outside the walls of the old city. The Kidron Valley, Mount of Olives is over here. And around over here, we can find the Pool of Siloam. Let's take a look. Whoops. Let's take a look at Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Here we have the Mount of Olives to the east. Here we have the walls of the old city. Now, what's important in those days, these were the walls in the time of Jesus. This was a secondary wall, a third wall was built, and here's Golgotha, the traditional location of the crucifixion. Here we can see the inside the city. We see the Pool of Siloam, and here we see the Essen Quarter. Now, we talked about the Essenes in the Dead Sea. That is most likely where Jesus' Last Supper was. According to where the upper room is today, for sure that is within the quarter of the Essenes. Now, we'll deal with in a few seconds how we can figure that out and how that corresponds with the actual textual stories. So somebody coming from the Pool of Siloam will be heading up to where? So I've heard some people trying to explain that it took place over here, but that's impossible because people could not, you had to eat in the meal. Some said it would be in the city of David. Possibly, but if they're heading up towards this area, they would meet somewhere in this area. Now, the amazing thing is, if that story is true, and I would say it probably is, in 1 second, we'll be able to see exactly where that took place. Here we have the model of Jerusalem that's in the Israel Museum. Here we have a wonderful mistake. This is the tomb of David. We'll deal in a second with the tomb of David, and the archaeologist, Professor Avigad, knew he was making a mistake, and he did it on purpose because he didn't want to offend people. This is the Essen Quarter, and this is where traditionally the Last Supper took place. You can see the houses, multiple stories. So, and here is what the house might have looked like. Here we have multiple rooms. Here we have the upper room. Now, to get to the upper room, you would enter from behind. You would not enter from within the house. The house would have many rooms. You'd have storage rooms. You have places you would sleep. You'd have place for the animals. So this would have been maybe what the upper room would have looked like. This is what houses in the time of Jesus would have looked like. Now, why the Essen Quarter? Here we can see a depiction of what the Essen Quarter would look like. Here we see where there was a gate, which was known as the Essen Gate, which is very interesting because it was actually discovered and found with a drain running underneath it. This element was discovered around 10 years ago. We see the various places. The most interesting of them is the Betzo. Why the Betzo? Because we had talked about it when we gave the talk on the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Essenes were extremely into purity. That's why we can see two very large mikvahs or ritual baths for them to bathe in. And what is interesting is the Betzo was in a way a bathroom. It's from the Hebrew term Beit Soah, the house of sewage or of excrements, because they would not go to the bathroom within the city of Jerusalem, because the city of Jerusalem was considered pure, even though the temple was considered impure. So this was where it was located. So why would Jesus have his Last Supper, or why would we say the Last Supper was in the Essen Quarter? Reason number one is tradition, and we'll see where the tradition comes from. From 3rd century on, that's where the Last Supper took place. Let's look at some verses. go into the city. In other words, of course, the Last Supper took place into the city. So we have that. 2, well, there's one thing that's not mentioned here, which is very important. Well, we'll go one at a time. Why inside the city? Because in Deuteronomy, we're told, thou mayest not sacrifice the Passover within any of thy gates which the Lord giveth to thee, but to the place where the Lord their God shall choose. You can only have the sacrifice in Jerusalem. Here, we can see near the church, which is traditionally, I would say it's not, but is traditionally where Caiaphas' house was, and that's where Jesus was imprisoned and tried. We see steps coming up from the Siloam pool, which are going up to the Essen Quarter. So if the story we're following is true, these are literally the actual steps that Jesus would have walked on, and his disciples would have met the man carrying water up to the Essen Quarter. Now, what is the Essene message that we get, or the sign that there was an Essene influence on the Last Supper? Is that the Pharisee tradition, as it is depicted, interestingly enough, in Luke and according to Paul, is you would first say the blessing over the wine. That's the Pharisee tradition. And it's the Jewish tradition till today. And then you say the blessing over the bread. The Essenes will first say the blessing over the bread and then over the wine. That's what took place in Matthew and in Mark. Now, where did that come from? That's an Essene influence, because all of the Essenes would do that. So we have a link to the story and the Essene tradition, which gives some additional credence to the fact that that might very well be the location. The tradition of the Last Supper in Jerusalem, we have, let's see what happened there. Josephus, the great Jewish historian, lived more or less parallel to Jesus, a little bit longer than him, says this, and a little bit after him, but first century there's AC, he says this: now, as soon as the army had no more people to slay or to plunder, because we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, because there remained none to be objects of their fury, for they could not have spared any, had there remained any of such work to be done. Caesar gave orders that they should demolish the entire city and temple. So where the Last Supper took place in Jerusalem, irrespective of where it was destroyed. Just like, I'm going to ruin your trip to Israel for some of you who might come here. When you reach the Gardens of Gethsemane, there will be tour guides who will tell you that the spectacular olive trees that are there are the olive trees dating back to the time of Jesus. Can't be, because Hadrian uprooted all the trees of Jerusalem, just like we're told that the order was given to destroy all of Jerusalem. In the 4th century, the Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, who was a brilliant scholar and wrote books on the geography of Jerusalem, and also wrote, interestingly enough, the biography of Constantine. In his book, Proof of the Gospel, he suggests that a portion of the city was largely unmolested and mentions upper church of the apostles. Now, what is the upper church of the apostles? There are traditions that there were 7 synagogues built on Mount Zion. In those 7 synagogues, one of them that survived was a Judo-Christian church, or I'd say a Judo-Christian synagogue, which was then later on known after 325 as the Church of the Apostles. The Pilgrim from Bordeaux, who was the earliest known documented pilgrim who documented what they said, who said this: inside, within the wall of Sion, Murusion, appeared the site where David had his palace. That's, of course, not true. There's again, because David's palace was in the Hinnom Valley. And of the 7 synagogues, Herod's palace was there. And of the 7 synagogues which had been there, just a single one remains. That is, we're talking about the Church of the Apostles. While all the others were plowed and tilled, just as the prophet Isaiah had said. And according to the Pilgrim of Bordeaux, which is probably 15, 20 years after Eusebius wrote his book, relates to the Church of the Apostles, that synagogue as becoming a church. When from there you go out of the wall of Zion, those proceeding to the Neapolitan gate, the Damascus gate, more or less what Damascus gate is today. In other words, passing through the place where the Golgotha, the hill of Golgotha was. Now, anybody who visits the room of the Last Supper knows that right beneath that is David's tomb, or as what is traditionally called David's tomb. Is it David's tomb? And if not, what is it doing there? In 1 Kings, we read, so David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. The city of David is where the original city of David was, is where the pool of Siloam is. Nothing to do with Mount Zion. Nehemiah, when they come back, we're told where that is, he told that and unto the stairs that go down from the city of David. Nothing to do with Mount Zion. And then we're told after him, Nehemiah, the son of Azbuk, the ruler of half of the part of Bethsur, unto the place over against the sepulchres of David and the pool of Siloam. So clearly not David's tomb. So what is David's tomb doing on Mount Zion? So a quick history of what happened on Mount Zion. A spectacular church was built in 379, known as Hagia Sion. And then we're told, when they proceeded to Sion, as you will find mentioned below, but even then they go to Sion before the third hour. This is, once again, there's a different pilgrim called Adukia who's telling the story of the ceremonies that take place, the dismissal having the first made the greater church, because this church was so spectacular, might have even been greater than the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And what took place in that? And in the same place where the church now stands in Sion, came in his disciples when the doors were shut. What happened there? That is when one of his disciples, Thomas, was absent, and when he returned, the other apostles told him that they had seen the Lord. He said, except I shall see, I will not believe, of course, doubting Thomas. So this is the location, but what happened there? Because in this great church, that is the place in Zion, that is another church there now, where once the Lord's passion, the multitude was gathered together with the apostles. So we're given a description of what had happened there. Here we see a 6th century mosaic. Anybody who's been to Jordan, the famous Mosaic of Madaba, which is based to a great extent on Eusebius's book, the Latin translation of Jerusalem. It's of all the holy sites. Here you can see the 2 Cardai. Here you can see the Damascus gate with the pillar here, just as an interesting side comment. Till today, the Damascus gate in Arabic is called Bab el Amud, the gateway of the pillar. And that is because there was a pillar there. Here you can see the Cardo. Here you can see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you follow the Stations of the Cross, one of these pillars is still intact. And here you see a huge church. And next to the huge church is a smaller church. Here you can see it enlarged, the huge Hagia Sion, but a smaller church is preserved. And if we locate it, that is the location of the room of the Last Supper, the upper room till today. Another depiction from the 6th century is an amazing mosaic in Rome, in the church of St. Mary Magnifica. We see the depiction of Hagia Sion, and if we look closely, we see another small church. Once again, this just from a different angle. So the place where the Last Supper takes place will date back probably to the 4th story. But what happened on Mount Zion according to various traditions? Let's see. Of course, the Last Supper. Then in Luke, we have Jesus appearing to his disciples. In John, we have doubting Thomas, who took place in the same location according to the tradition. Here we have Matthew selected as the new 12th apostle according to the book of Acts. We have the Pentecost taking place 50 days or 7 weeks after after the Passover. We have the interment of Jesus' brother James. James, who we talked about it before, the leader of the Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem, was executed by being thrown off of most likely what is traditionally the same location the devil tested Jesus on, the Temple Mount. He was executed from there. It is the home of Mary, mother of John Mark, which is an interesting, and some say that's where the Last Supper took place. That's how they knew who they were. Mary, one of the many Marys, was the mother of John Mark, traditionally the Mark who wrote the Gospel according to Mark. And that's, according to Acts, was where the house was. The house where John and Mary. So Mary and John, Jesus asks John to take care of, there's the Mary take care of, John take care of each other. And there's a tradition that that's where he was buried. And there's a tradition that that's where Mary was assumed to heaven. She was taken up to heaven. And there's a church there called the Dormition, because there's an argument whether Mary died or she slept. The term Dormition was taken up to heaven on Mount Zion, very close to where the Last Supper is. There's also the Church of the Dormition. And in 415, the bones of Saint Stephen that were found in the town of Gamla, once again, back to our friend Rabbi Gamliel, who Paul said was his teacher. The bones of Saint Stephen were found and were deposited there. And then later on, they were taken to a different location, very close to where the Garden Tomb is today. Here is a short film we're going to do without volume, but of the room of the Last Supper today. Now, we start off with this, which is very interesting. This is a mihrab or a mahrib, which points to the direction of the prayer of Muslims, in other words, facing Mecca. Why is this in the room of the Last Supper? Because beneath this room is the tomb of King David. Now, the tomb of King David is a tradition probably from the 10th century. We don't know if Christians started it or Muslims started it, but at the end, Jews, Christians, and Muslims accepted the tradition. And King David was an important person in Islam also. So when the Muslims took control in 1551 of the area and took it away from the from the Franciscans, they took where the upper room was and turned it into a mosque. Now you can see Roman pillars, and these pillars now, some of these pillars date back clearly to the Byzantine period, but they're secondary use. The base of this room even has some Herodian elements in it, even though it is today accepted that it was originally built in the 4th century and then rebuilt in around 1225 by the Crusaders. This is just a tree that was donated. The tradition of Christianity, as Paul said, being grafted into the root of Judaism. So there you have the olive tree with the grafting taking place. And we'll just jump forward for a second to get a few more views of the room. Now, what's interesting, here we have the upper room. There's one of the traditions say that's the room of the Holy Spirit. You can see that this was rebuilt because the pillars and the pillar tops are not the same. They were collected from different areas. And this is the traditional upper room today. You can see verses from the Quran in Arabic. You can see the pillars, but the location has been traditionally the location since the 4th century. Now we're zooming in on one of the most interesting pillars there. And this gives us a direct link to the Last Supper. Why? Good question. Here we can see, you can't see them perfectly, but you can see some flamencos here. And you have two flamencos digging into the flesh, or literally eating the blood of the flamencos. Now, once again, this is my blood, and you will be nourished from it in a way. It'll give you life. It'll give you eternal life. And that's more or less what's happening with these flamencos. Now, where did this crazy idea come from that would lead Crusaders to use this picture? Well, one, in Roman zoology, the tradition is that if there is no food, the mother flamenco will feed its baby chicks its blood. Now here we actually and let's look what's happening. See the baby chick? Looks like one of the flamingos is digging into the head of the other and actually feeding it blood. That's not really what's happening. There's an element of rejuberation that feeds almost like a red milk. So he's rejuvenating it and it's going down from here. But here we have the tradition of giving life, the elements of the artist with a brilliant idea, just like the flamenco's blood gives life to the young ones, so Jesus's blood, this is my blood, gave life to his followers. Now, here we have just an interesting additional connection is, again, what is the connection to David? We said it's not the place, but the connection between the New Testament continues to try to find a connection between David and Jesus. In Acts, we're told, men and brethren, let me speak unto you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his sepulcher is with us unto this day. And that you have the sepulcher where now in Revelations, the links come all the time. And one of the elders saith unto me, weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and loose. And again, what are they talking about? The root of Jesus being from the root of David in Revelations, it takes it to another additional direction. And I saith unto him, Sir, thou knowest, as he said to me, these are they which came out of a greater tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white with the blood of the Lamb. In other words, people are purified through Jesus's blood. So you have the connection of lamb and lion, and these are newly discovered just a couple of years ago when they were fixing up the place. Here you have the Gothic arches, or the really Crusader arches, and here you actually have a lamb depicted there, depicting Jesus, and here you have a second one of a lion depicting David. So linking between what Revelations talks about, the lion and the lamb. Not the story of the lion sleeping with the lamb, because that's not what the Bible says. It says that a wolf will live with a lamb, but here you have the lion and the lamb, and the two elements coming together, because the basic concept was the tradition was that Jesus represented brought together the kingship on one and the prophecy and the leadership on the other. Kingship is David, prophecy is Moses. We talked about the connection. And here, of course, we have wonderful dolls of Moses, Jesus, and David. Jesus as Moses, we have that Moses inaugurates the long-awaited new Exodus. He set into motion by a new Passover that we talked about, the Paschal Lamb, Jesus the Paschal Lamb. He brings back the miracle of manna from heaven, but you are fed, Moses brought manna, you are fed with my word. He gathered the 12 tribes of heaven into tribes of Israel into a heavenly eschatological kingdom of God. So once again, Moses freeing the 12 tribes, Jesus trying to feed the 12 tribes, all by means of sacrificial death, and the prophetic sign of his death that he performed at the Last Supper. And remember that Moses had offered the sprinkled blood and the blood of the covenant, as we talked about. And Jesus and David, the Lion of Judah, the leadership that then goes on. So with that, we have concluded the talk. We only were able to really touch certain elements because we even went over a bit by time, but each one of these, again, the different meanings, as we talked about, between the school of Peter and the school of James, and how the Last Supper was interpreted, is a whole talk unto its own, as are the locations. But if anybody has any questions, comments, please feel free to direct them and I will try to answer them.